So I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's morning, it's evening in some places from where we're being joined. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this Africa PPP Roundtable. And as many of you know, this is a spin-off from the Africa PPP Day that we held in 2023 that was also organized by the World Association of PPP Units, the Africa chapter. We had your cry that one day of virtual meetings was too long, and so we decided to break it up into 2 days of smaller palatable sessions. And today is the second and last session of today, where we will be discussing project structuring for bankability. My name is Prima Atugonza. I am the co-chair of the Africa chapter of WAPPP. In my other life, I also work with the Africa Legal Support Facility, where I lead the PPP and infrastructure team, and I am honored today to moderate this very important conversation. So during this conversation, we are going to be talking about structuring for bankability, and the background of this conversation really comes from the fact that whilst many public players, and the previous session covered project preparation and talked a lot about feasibility studies, but there seems to be a new narrative that whilst there are many feasibility studies, there's still a gap before projects are taken to market. And so the purpose of this conversation is to really try and fill that gap. And so we will, for this particular project discussion, I'd like you to think about having a feasibility study, a good feasibility study that has been done, but we now need to go to market, and so would like to fill this gap. And that is what we're calling the period, the very key critical period of structuring the project so that it can actually be taken up by the market. I am joined by a panel of PPP practitioners from different spheres of the PPP world, and they will be sharing their diverse experience in the structuring phase. So ladies first, and I will therefore start with Ivy Murugi, or who we're calling Dr. Ivy today, because it might just be a good mistake. Ivy is a dual qualified infrastructure finance lawyer with deep expertise in project finance, PPPs, and impact-driven investments. She's currently counsel at the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which many of us know, where she works with governments across Africa to structure bankable infrastructure projects, mobilizing private capital to deliver high-impact development outcomes. Welcome, Ivy.
Thank you, Prima, and I'll definitely take the doctor.
Oh, yes. I'm also
Looking
joined
forward to the
by
discussion.
Thank you, Ivy. I'm also joined by Maud Valet, who's the division manager and head of operations at the Africa Legal Support Facility, which is an international organization hosted by the African Development Bank. Maud leads the projects team of nearly 30 lawyers, and this team provides legal and transactional advisory support to African countries. Maud oversees the implementation of more than 120 projects and capacity building programs in the areas of PPPs, natural resources and extractives, energy, and sovereign finance. Welcome to the conversation, Maud.
Thank you, Prima. And good afternoon, good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Maud. I'll try not to be biased when it comes to you. Please join me in also welcoming Dr. Gori Oloshina Daniel. So today it's not all women and it's also not all lawyers. Dr. Oloshina is a managing partner at Africa PPP Advisory Services. He's a business economist with over 24 years of experience as a transactions advisor to governments, multilaterals, and private companies. He has worked with Deloitte, DT Global, the World Bank, FDB, FCDO, and the Transport for London on research, policy, strategy, and transaction advisory assignments. Welcome to the conversation, Dr. Oloshina.
Thank you, Prima. Thanks for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our participants.
Thank you. Last but absolutely not least, please join me in welcoming Mr. Nathaniel Monetsi. He's currently the head of structured finance at the Gauteng Infrastructure Financing Agency, also known as GIFA. He leads a team of infrastructure project preparation and finance specialists, providing strategic financial advisory across infrastructure sectors like water, sanitation and hygiene, transport, energy, and social services, such as health and education. Nathaniel's pipeline currently has 31 infrastructure projects estimated at a value of about USD 3.5 billion that are all in different phases of development, from sourcing to financial close. Welcome, Nathaniel.
Thank you, Prima. I'm happy to be part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to have some housekeeping, please insert your questions in the Q&A chat box. So as opposed to putting them in the chat, please put them in Q&A. We have people behind the scenes that are collecting them so that we ensure that the panelists address your questions. So we will jump straight to it, and I'll start with you, Dr. Gori. And as an advisor on PPPs on the continent, please set for us the scene. Like I said earlier before, the narrative is that there are many feasibility studies that have been done, but these have remained unutilized due to the lack of structuring support. Is this true? And if so, what does it actually take to structure a PPP project before taking it to market?
Thank you, Prima. This is a really important conversation for us to have. Particularly that we're in a stage in Africa where compared to the last 10, 15 years, where PPPs were not very well understood and certainly not embraced as a way of tackling the significant infrastructure deficit to a point where it's been embraced, whether that is because the clarity that government resources are insufficient to meet and address that challenge. Now, the new challenge is we've embraced this. We have spent significant resources pulling together feasibility studies, and where's the promised finance? And for me, I think this speaks to the twin challenge of the demand and supply side for private sector resource mobilization. And I know, Prima, you said, what should we do before taking projects to market? But I think that it's important to take a step back and realize that the key distinction about PPPs is that there are multiple party interests that need to be understood, and they need to be incorporated in the conceptualization, design, and implementation of PPPs. And what do I mean by this? You have project sponsors who typically are the public sector, you have the private investors, and you have the financiers. And the idea of picking projects without really thinking about where the money is going to come from, where the interest is going to come from in terms of private sector participants is probably something that we should take another look at. And what I mean by that explicitly, and for the clients that we support, we have a pipeline of about $15 billion dollars across the continent. And our starting point for clients is always, what does the market really say about these projects, right? How are we screening these projects to ensure that these projects not only have an economic rationale, not only have a strategic component in the sense that they're part of the strategic priorities of the host countries, but is the market ready or interested in these projects? From a public sector perspective, are you ready to provide the support that it requires? And we've used words like bankability, and we use words like project structuring, and it's useful for us, to understand that really when we talk about bankability, we're really talking about the ability to structure a project in such a way that it has sufficient and predictable cash flows in order to repay any sort of debt, cover operational costs, and provide returns to investors. You've got to really do that sort of hard work. So we've got to step away from looking at feasibility studies for projects that have been selected, perhaps for political expediency or other sort of considerations, to ensuring that we are allocating resources to the development of projects that we have identified that the market is ready to support, that completely aligns with the strategic priorities of government, which basically means you won't have a situation where you have a start and you have a stop. And I see Nathaniel nodding. Take and how the how train, for instance, is an example of one of these sort of big ticket large projects, right? That would never have got off the ground if the government of South Africa did not get 100% behind it, if they couldn't find credible off-takers credible private sector players who would come in to help run it. So there are a number of different things that need to be considered, and I can give you a whole list, but just to summarize, projects have to be selected on the basis that there's early market sounding to establish the fact that there's investor appetite to engage. You've got to look at the revenue models and recognize that where, for instance, there's the conceptualization that a project could be paid for by users, those revenues are sufficient. And when they're not sufficient, mechanisms can be put in place, maybe viability gap funding, maybe creative ways of reducing the cost of capital to ensure that the revenues are more than sufficient to meet any sort of borrowings, for instance. You've got to make sure that you are having not only credible private sector parties, but even the project sponsors are credible. They can be relied upon to see that project through to implementation and to meet whatever obligations they sign up to in a concession agreement. I'm sure that as we continue in this conversation, there's a bit more that we'll be able to bear in mind here. But the reasons why we have to consider all of these things is financiers will not deploy the capital that's available if the cash flows are not predictable. If those cash flows can be impacted by changes in government policy, can be impacted by the fact that you have a private sector operator that doesn't really have the capability to execute, or there's a likelihood that risk delivery and implementation risks haven't been addressed in such a way, maybe through sound contracts between all parties, that can ensure that there will be no disruption that makes otherwise predictable cash flows less predictable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Gori. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that it's not enough to have a feasibility study. You must have a feasibility study that's able to match demand and supply. And that's what you've called the twin challenge of having studies that are matching the demand of the market so that the government is supplying what the demand needs. And you've given us quite a number of examples of what needs to be done beyond the feasibility study. And so I will move over to you, Maud, because I know that the ALSF is doing quite a lot to try and fill this gap. And I know that legal and regulatory frameworks will always be the first stop or the first line of action when it comes to reinforcement of PPPs on the continent. We also at the ALSF recently published the PPP brochure that reflects the legal and regulatory framework across the continent. But will this affect bankability? Will this help to fill the gap that we are talking about? Are the frameworks good enough, or are private parties asking for more than this? Maybe just to add to what Dr. Gori was saying. Over to you, Maud.
Thank you, Prima, for the questions. Actually, what I'm going to say will probably complement a little bit what Dr. Gori said, maybe in a different way. But before I answer more precisely to the question, let me talk to you a little bit about the brochure, since you mentioned it. So it is in 2016 that the ALSF started to develop PPP country profiles to assess the progress of developing PPP legal frameworks in African countries. Based on the collected data, we carried out a comparative analysis of existing legal and institutional PPPs framework in Africa. This publication, as well as the PPP country profiles, are available on the ALSF website, so do not hesitate to visit our website. And I'm very happy to announce you that we are planning to update them starting this year. So to start answering to the question, of course, the analysis we have carried out does not directly address the challenge of projects bankability on the continent. However, it offers a comparative analysis of existing PPP frameworks that can be helpful for governments that are considering including PPPs as a method for delivering public assets and services, or also wish to assess the effectiveness of their existing frameworks. This tool can also help the private investor who wish to gain a better understanding on how legal PPP frameworks operate in different jurisdictions in Africa. And ultimately, we believe that it can contribute to ensure that adopted PPP laws effectively promote a pipeline of bankable projects likely to attract investors. So now, are good frameworks enough to reassure private parties on the bankability potential of PPPs? Not sure. We all know that PPPs cannot be developed in a vague legal environment without rules to ensure transparent and efficient implementation. It would be like trying to build a house without plans or foundations. A good legal framework creates stable environment that can encourage long-term investment. It also outlines a transparent decision-making path to regulate, guide, give confidence to the actors involved, and it will clarify, and I think it is extremely important, the distribution of responsibility, not only between public and private partners, but also between the public entities involved. Sometimes we all know it, we can see a lot of difficulties of communication or involve entities, Ministry of Finance not talking to the sectorial ministry, etc. We see it a lot. So the precise answer to your question is no, not entirely. A good PPP framework does not directly translate to an increased deal flow. Several jurisdictions, despite having exemplary law and regulation, project preparation funds, etc., have encountered persistent challenges in converting legal potential into actual PPP deals. Legal frameworks are critical, but they are part of a broader ecosystem of political will, market maturity, technical capacity, and financial depth. So what is missing? Private investor will look at country with a realistic project pipeline with demand certainty. They will expect well-prepared project with robust feasibility studies. It was discussed previously. Clear commercial logic, realistic and transparent revenue models. I think Dr. Goury mentioned that a lot, as well as balanced risk-sharing structures. Investors will also feel more reassured by countries that tend to show consistent political will at the highest level. Unclear or slow decision-making kill deals. This is very important to remember that. Likewise, more stable macroeconomic and regulatory environment can reassure investors, as this will reduce the risk of abrupt policy reversals that could affect PPP returns. Dedicated PPP units that understand international standards, speak the language of investors, and rely on well-trained civil servants who can manage the complex PPP lifecycle is another strong argument for investors. To use again the analogy of the house under construction, if we have good plans but no equipped workers or qualified architect to monitor the progress of the construction, we risk having big problem with the property developer. Investor will also expect stable enforcement of contracts over the life of the project and confidence that the government will honor its obligation even after political transition. We also need to be aware that sometimes investors will favor larger and more diversified economies with bigger infrastructure needs, leading to more project opportunities and more predictable demand for services. The fact that some countries have benefited from strong multilateral support to de-risk projects through guarantees, technical assistance, and capacity building can also be a determining factor for investors. Countries that have more experience using certain financial instruments, such as viability gap funding, partial risk and credit guarantees or blended finance structure can also be more attractive. Finally, government will be much more attractive for private partners, and this is what we experience at the LSF, if they understand that PPPs are not just there to close funding gaps, but can be used to leverage private sector innovation and encourage flexibility in design to enable the private partners to propose more efficient and impactful solutions.
Thank you very much, Maud, and thank you for making it clear that it's a whole host of factors that is needed to actually bring a project to to fruition and to life. And I know that one of the things that you've mentioned, even during structuring, is that you need the different government agencies to be talking to themselves. You need to make sure that by the time the project goes to market, the Ministry of Finance, the contracting authority, and all the other players are very well aware of this project. I like the analogy that you've used about building a house, and I was looking for a way in which to ensure that Ivy, who is representing the financiers today, can form part of this analogy. And at the end, you gave it to me, which is she's the developer. So Ivy, we have a plan, and those are the laws. We are addressing, trying to equip the workers, and that's trying to do all the capacity building that's being done on the continent. And we're doing all the preparatory work that needs to be done, but we need the project to be developed and we need the project to be financed. So what are the critical factors that in structuring a PPP project that you look at as financial advisors, or what is it that makes a project attractive to yourselves? Because we would like to ensure that whilst there is supply, there is demand on your side. So what is it that will influence demand and what will make the house come to life? Over to you, Ivy.
Thank you, Prima. It's a really good analogy. And I think a lot of what Dr. Gorias and Maud have said is really quite indicative of what a financier will be looking at. If you're looking at, sort of this analogy of constructing a house, we are sort of going to be looking at it from the perspective of, okay, what is the actual asset that you're asking us as financiers to come on board to finance here? And so if we could take just a step back on looking at sort of these critical pillars that financiers will look at, some of the big determinants will be revenue certainty. I know that different speakers have touched on this in different ways, but just to go a little deeper into it, you kind of want to see a project that can show you what the path is to financial sustainability and financial viability. And by that, we mean that we want to see whether the model is user tariffs, whether the model is that the government entity is going to pay. You kind of want to see, once we've finished the construction of this house, are we turning it into a hotel that is going to be, providing us with some revenue? And I just use this analogy quite loosely, but you kind of want to be able to see very certain revenue streams for the lifetime of the project, and also to be able to secure these revenue streams. So sometimes this also comes with considerations as to who's going to be paying these revenue streams. What are the payment mechanics that we're putting in place in order for these revenue streams to be actualized? It's one thing to say that we will pay. It's another thing to actually pay. And so you, as a financier, you're going to want to be able to see what is the strength of the party that we're actually doing this project with. Because like you said, there are different stakeholders who are sort of come together in a marriage of sorts for the lifetime of the project. You have on the one side the project sponsor, that's the government. You have the contracting authority, who will definitely come as one of the parties that might be responsible for the making of payments. And we want to be able to see that this contracting authority, or whoever will be responsible for making payments, has the ability to pay. If it's a user charge, we want to see what mechanics are we putting in place in order to collect these user charges. And the whole point is to be able to say to whoever's constructing your house, this is how we're going to pay you for the work that you've done in constructing the house. This is how we're going to be able to pay you for your work in operating this hotel. And we know you've borrowed money in order for you to be able to do this construction and for you to be able to do operations and maintenance. This is how we intend to put you in a position that you will be able to pay the obligations that you have to your lenders for all the financing that they've put in for us to be able to do this project together. So kind of think of it as, we kind of want certainty that there will be a revenue stream, and a revenue stream that can be secured, and that the person who's making the commitment to pay can actually pay it. Now, in an ideal world, all those things align, and in certain kinds of projects, it's much easier for you to have that sort of definition across the project lifetime. Particularly, I think in the more common sphere where you see this is, say, for example, energy projects. Not to say that they're without their challenges, but those are some of the projects where it's quite easy to see what the revenue stream is and how you can sort of secure that revenue stream, what components go to lenders, how is the tariff reflective of the actual cost of the construction and the operations and the maintenance, and for the life of the project, how are those revenues going to be streamed back from, most times it's a utility, back into the generating SPVs. It becomes a little less clear, the farther away you are from some of this, predominantly defined types of PPPs. And so when it becomes a little uncertain is where you start having to think about what can we possibly do in order to reassure the financiers that this, one, the person that is taking the party that is taking the responsibility to pay can actually pay. If they're unable to pay, what measures can we take to bolster their creditworthiness in order for them to give confidence that they will meet this obligation? You also start to look at, if it's a tariff-based model, and of course, as we know with PPPs, there are instances where there is a social objective with the infrastructure that is to be constructed and operated. If there is, sort of this inability for the tariff to be cost reflective, then what measures do we need to take in place in order to sort of reduce the capital costs or to bridge the difference between the actual financing needs of the project and what users can pay? And in these sorts of circumstances is where you start to enter the realm of what other methods of financing are available. Is it necessary for the contracting authority to get a subsidy program in place, for example, in order for that subsidy to subsidize some of the costs to users? And then, because of that, then the tariff can be maintained at the level that reflects the government and social objective. Is it necessary for us to look for viability gap funding, which will reduce the cost, which will reduce capital costs on the project? Is it necessary for us to, maybe explore concessional capital financing models that, will give us, lower interest rates to sort of balance the total cost of capital on the project? So you kind of look at it in terms of, am I going to be able to meet my financial obligations? If I'm not able to meet my financial obligations, what are the different levels in the project that we can use to make this to enable us to meet this obligation or to reduce the amount of the obligation that will be there? And so, that sort of revenue certainty is a critical factor. I think one other, and this sort of ties us into, how we also allocate some of the risks, because this does affect pricing on projects. I think a lot of speakers have said this even in the first session, sometimes there is, a desire to sort of offload as many risks as possible to different parties on the project. But again, like sort of building a house, you're not going to ask your electrician to do the plumbing work just because, they are available on the ground. You kind of have to be able to allocate what is best allocated to each party in the transaction. So you kind of have to think of it in a very practical and in a very realistic way. If you're thinking about who is best placed, for example, if we're doing some sort of social infrastructure, and the government, for example, is responsible for the acquisition of, say, land, because there's already a legal framework. As Maud said, bridging that gap between what the legal framework says and what we can achieve within the legal framework. If there's a legal framework that allows government to take responsibility for certain risks, including the acquisition of the land, the putting in place appropriate measures in order to sort of de-risk the project from, you're thinking about sort of your political FM events. You kind of have to start thinking about what is the most practical, who is best placed to actually take this risk. Is the government best placed or the contracting authority best placed to take on demand risk? Who is going to take the risk of, who's going to take, a bit of the market risk? So you kind of have to start thinking about it practically. Sometimes these risks are shared, but from a finances perspective, what we're sort of looking to see is a reliable risk profile. So we kind of want to see that we're thinking through the risks, and there are some universal risks, general categories that apply across most PPP projects. And when you start to sort of bottom into it, you can see what the specifics are. But we kind of want to see that the risk profile is very sort of realistic, and also very sort of thoughtfully allocated, and this goes again to what sort of mitigation measures you're taking in place to address these risks, right? If you are seeing,
Sorry, I'm just going to stop you there because we're going to get into a deeper conversation on risk, and I'll be
Yes.
coming to you. But even as you speak, you remind me of a certain somebody who says his favorite word currently is tariffs. And it looks like the financiers' favorite word seems to be tariffs as well. So what I am hearing from you is that structuring from a financial or a financier's perspective is how will we be paid? That's what structuring is. So irrespective of the beautiful technical work that you have done, the justifications that you have done for a PPP, when all is said and done, you're looking for a private party to finance this. The private party is going to look for a lender, and lenders are looking at that feasibility study and saying, how will we be paid? When will we be paid? What is the certainty of payment? And I know that South Africa has been one of the most successful countries. South Africa is our shining star on the continent when it comes to PPPs, because I mean, you have while some countries are signing their first deals, South Africa has projects that are at handback stage. So we stand to learn a lot from the country. And you have very successful projects such as the Gautrain Rapid Rail Link, which are really, like I said, shining stars on the continent. So, and Nathaniel, could you advise us on the factors that have contributed to the proper structuring and therefore eventual success of this project?
Thank you very much, Prima. I fully agree with your observation that South Africa is one of the leading countries so far as execution of PPPs is concerned. I think if you look at the history of PPPs in countries since 1998, we've executed almost 35 PPPs as we speak. And at the center of it really are a number of factors. I just want maybe to highlight a few of those. Firstly, it's a supportive legislation as well as a regulatory framework. So as you might know, the PPP framework in South Africa is anchored under Treasury Regulation number 16 of the Public Finance Management Act. And what that does really is to give confidence and comfort to investors from the private sector point of view. The PFMA, or rather the Treasury Regulation number 16, gives or guides the process in terms of how you design your feasibility, what goes into your feasibility, the areas that you need to look at from a needs assessment point of view, which then informs how you then allocate those risks, but most importantly, how you also structure those risks. And it has actually culminated into the development of a PPP guide, which actually guides developers from conception or inception of the project, but most importantly, as you are in the structuring phase, how are you going to best allocate the risks that are key in the project? The second and most important factor is also the fact that South Africa has got a very sustainable and steady fiscal framework, which speaks to the fact that if you're going for a budget PPP, you know for a fact that there is going to be an assurance of a revenue stream or an assured cash flow that is coming from the public sector, which also gives assurance from a structuring point of view. If you're structuring a budget PPP, there is an assurance that for the next 20 years, government is going to stand behind this project and my cash flow is sort of ring-fenced. But at the center of it, I just want to highlight that beyond just support for budgetary PPPs, that framework also allows for government to come in and support projects that might not be viable from a commercial point of view. You mentioned the example of the Gautrain. If you look at that project commercially from the user charges, that project is not or was not going to be viable, but there is a very strong backing from that fiscal framework that allowed the government to come in, first of all, to provide a patronage guarantee that says in the event of volumes of users going below a certain level, the government of South Africa through the Gauteng province will kick in and close that gap. Number one. Number two, the framework also allows for the government to come in and provide viability funding in the form of capital investment grant. We are working on a project right now for the city of Johannesburg, which is a waste to energy project. That project is not viable from user charges or get fees point of view. But because of this framework, which is sustainable and which is strong, the government has been able to come in and support the project with a capital investment grant of almost up to 2 billion rand. So that flexibility gives assurance and comfort to investors. Then the third point that I want to also say is South Africa has got a very strong and robust capital market comprised of commercial banks, private equity firms, insurance companies, pension funds, and DFIs. So what that does is, as you are creating and structuring your project, you've got a very strong base upon which to market test and market sound your projects so that they are able to give you what would make this project attractive to them. You don't surprise the market by issuing a tender document that has been market tested, or by issuing a PPP agreement that has been market tested. So what that enables us to do is we are preparing projects. We have got a sounding board that is readily available to give input into the structuring and packaging of PPPs. So if you go back to the first point I mentioned about the PPP guide under the Tiara 16, most of the documents in terms of RFP and PPP agreements, they've been market tested, they've been market sounded, and in a way standardized, which helps that if you are working on a office accommodation PPP, it's standardized and it's market tested by a number of developers and over the years. So that in a way assists us to develop and structure projects that are attractive. The last point also that I want to mention is the fact that government supports project preparation in a number of ways. And it's one advice that I might also need to give to fellow African governments, that if you want a strong and favorable PPP framework or successful PPP projects, you must invest in making sure that the projects are well prepared, the projects are also well structured. So there is a very strong network of DFIs such as the DBSA that also support project preparation in addition to what the government is doing. There is also capacity in terms of technical skills in the market that one can also market test and market sound as you are preparing and structuring projects. So I think let me stop here for now, so far as that SA story is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. And I think you have given us a host of factors to think about. And I think you're just letting us know that there must be an ecosystem that works. There must be an ecosystem that works, but that also speaks to each other. So of course, when we've had a lot of political support, the need for political support as a point that has been given even in the earlier session, but I think that the need for political support goes beyond advocacy and just speaking about PPPs, but it must also be reflected in the fiscal decisions of the country. It must also be reflected in the fiscal ecosystem within the country. And so when you talk about the government of South Africa being ready to back projects through viability gap funding and being able to give guarantees or some form of reassurance to the private sector, that is what actually shows political support beyond after speaking about it and making all these sometimes political speeches that we hear. It is actually seen when you make differences in the fiscal decisions within the country. Now, I know that South Africa might seem like a dream because, of course, when you hear all these insurance companies, there's a strong economy that can back PPPs. Not all countries have an economy that's as strong as South Africa, but all countries can do PPPs. And it comes through, of course, like we talked about, the plans, the contracts that you're drafting. And so I'd like to change gears a bit and begin to talk about the nature of the documentation that we prepare for these projects and how that can help with structuring. And so I'd like to hear from all the panelists how contracts can be structured to both attract private parties as well as ensure the financial sustainability of projects over the long term. I'll start with you, Dr. Gori.
Thank you, Prima. I think the issue of contracts is one that needs really close attention for PPPs, and I say this because based on the fact that you have multiple parties involved. So we've said it. You have the project sponsor, you have the concessionaire, who typically is multi-layered because you have a consortium, you have EPC contractors, you have O&M contractors, and you've got to really be able to think through. And I know the lawyers in the room will tell us a little bit more about this, the milieu of contracts that ensure that revenue certainty that we talked about. Because if, going back to the analogy of the house, if the house is not built, right, it won't be rented. So you've got to, and that basically means the lender who is expecting to be paid once the house is rented or sold can't start getting those payments until that is tackled. But the time to think about that is not during implementation, it's before. It's just basically making sure that there are contractual mechanisms in place to ensure certainty about not just the availability of that property, but that it will meet the specifications that are required for people to be able to get in and begin to either, habitate it. So, so your contracts really need to think about the allocation of the risks, the mitigation of the risks identified. And I think to Ivy's point, that is so important because we can't just be willy-nilly dishing out risks because it has an impact on the cost, right? There are some risks that are better managed by the public sector. There are others that are managed by, EPC contractors that have specific qualifications and capabilities. And, all of that needs to be thought ahead of time. And the last thing that I want to say about this idea of contracts being a risk mitigation mechanism is the fact that is the fact that the whole process of calibrating what a contract needs to look like must be something that is, market sounded and market tested, as Nathaniel said, because it's one thing as a project sponsor to, get very good lawyers to put together, draft contract agreements, as is the case in, jurisdictions like South Africa and others who are invested in standardized documents. Is another thing to be able to engage with the investment community to actually understand what this means from a costing point of view, from a pricing point of view, from an optimal structure point of view. And you find that when you're doing that sort of market sounding and market testing, you are recognizing, perhaps different approaches, different ways to ensure that the contract that you're putting out is a contract that the investment community can get behind, is a contract that addresses optimally the risks that you're trying to manage. Because you can spend time actually costing what that looks like if it was engaged and testing whether or not the market is ready for that sort of arrangement. And I guess the impression I'm trying to give here is that we've got to really see that sort of contract calibration exercise as one that is a negotiation, right? That calls for some degree of give and take rather than something that, take it or leave it. And the sort of take it or leave it approach, right, is one of the reasons why, projects are, once you put together tender documents, once you put together concession agreements that the market is thinking this would never make sense, you have failed transactions, right? And so, getting that sort of market sounding and market testing correct is critically important.
Thank you, Dr. Gori. And I know that mod structuring contracts is your bread and butter at the ALSF. So I'd like to hear from you. It's my turn to ask the questions today. How you structure contracts in a way that ensures that there is sustainability over the a long period throughout the contract.
Thank you, Prima. Actually, I really like the expression calibration exercise that was mentioned by Dr. Gori. Based on our experience at the LSF, comprehensive PPP contracts, it's much more than a mere legal document. It really needs to reflect the government's commitment and the credibility and also the effectiveness of the process the government's going to use to attract private partners. While ensuring long-term financial sustainability, the contract must do two things very well: set clear expectations and demonstrate institutional seriousness. First, strong contracts need to include detailed provision, of course, to reduce ambiguity and define how challenges will be handled, which is critical to build the investor confidence. So the calibration part of this exercise is extremely important. And also to complete that, the process matters as much as the product. A rigorous, transparent negotiation process signals to the market that the government is not just testing its position, but is genuinely prepared to share risk. I think it was mentioned by Evie as well and Dr. Gori. This is especially important in politically sensitive areas. And I'm going to talk I'm going to give the example of political force majeure. We have observed recently in a Southern African context, reluctance from a government to assume the risk of political force majeure. When governments refuse to assume such risk, maybe to limit fiscal exposure, they can have very good reason for that, they risk inadvertently to damage investor confidence. Investor could interpret this as a signal that the government is testing its market position rather than reassuring on its seriousness. Balanced risk allocation that reflects market reality is therefore not just a legal or a contractual exercise, it is a trust-building mechanism and process. Contract must protect public interests while showing that the government is a credible counterpart. A well-structured PPP contract that harmonizes detailed contractual provision with a transparent government process will more likely lead to a bankable project and create an investment environment resilient to market fluctuation, but also to political uncertainties. I would add that flexibility is also key. Contracts should leave room for the private sector to innovate rather than lock them into rigid technical inputs. For example, incorporating climate adaptation clauses, which allow adjustment in response to evolving environmental risk, can make projects more resilient and attractive to sustainable investors. These clauses can facilitate access to green finance and attract capital from funds dedicated to sustainable investment. It can also broaden the spectrum of potential private partners. However, we also know that overly complex provision can backfire. The challenge is then to design clauses that are both flexible and enforceable to guarantee that they truly add value without introducing excessive complexity. And more generally, it can be good to include in the contractual structure mechanism for contract management and periodic reviews to adjust the contract to change without introducing excessive complexity. This will ensure that the project remains financially viable in the long term. So to summarize what I just said, a well-structured PPP contract is a blend of legal clarity, risk realism, and strategic foresight. It is not just about closing a deal, it is about building a long-term partnership that can weather uncertainty and deliver value for all parties involved.
Thank you very much, Maud. And I would like to, because you mentioned the fact that with the contract that you are sending to the market, you should make sure that you are not just testing your market position, but that you are showing private parties and you're also showing lenders the seriousness of the government. And so I'd like to come to you, Ivy, and ask you, what does a well-structured contract look like for you as financiers?
It's a really good question, Prima, and I really like the analogies that we've been developing, especially around this sort of discussion around sort of calibrating the different party positions using the contracts, and also sort of thinking about it as a long-term partnership. And so you kind of want the contracts to reflect the intent of the parties, to be transparent, to be clear on their obligations, and also to be clear on what happens if one of the parties is not meeting their obligations in the long term. I think I've had someone once describe a PPP project as a very very committed marriage. You kind of want to be discussing all the good things when you're still in this sort of honeymoon phase where you're still sort of exploring and calibrating how you can work together. And what that looks like is a lot, as Maud and Dr. Gray have described. You kind of want this certainty on certain key terms. And the certainty on certain key terms is, as Maud has just said, you kind of want certainty on who takes what obligations in the contract. You want certainty on what are these obligations that each party is going to meet. You want certainty on, if I fail to meet my obligations, what happens? What happens if in year 7, we have an event that makes one party unable to meet their obligations that is not entirely their fault? What happens, and how do the other parties react to that event? So these are some of the key hallmarks that we kind of want to see in that contract. Again, going back to revenues and how revenues flow, you kind of want a very well thought out revenue and payment mechanism structured into the contracts. So we've determined who does what is the standard, who takes what obligations, what is the standard that is expected to satisfy in order for the other parties to the contract to be satisfied that those obligations have been met well. And if they meet those obligations, how are these parties then properly remunerated for having met these obligations? And if we fail, or if for some reason something goes wrong, what happens in those circumstances? And I think the very last point there is usually also a very big negotiation point. You kind of want for the parties in the contract to, sort of all papers on the table, all cards on the table to say, if something does go wrong in these projects, the financiers will want to see that they can actually be made whole. That's usually, a very, it's a very critical point that parties must appreciate. At the end of the day, financiers need to be made whole despite what happens to the project. And sometimes that takes a bit, as Maud said, a bit of a give and take between the contracting authority, the government, and also the sponsors. And sometimes even the lenders will have to take, a bit of a hit. But, just sort of thinking about these things in advance and putting them in the contract does give a lot of certainty that the parties, including the government, are thinking long term about and are demonstrating seriousness about not just getting to close and signing contracts, but actually implementing and seeing these projects live to their productive use for the period of time that the parties want them to live to their productive use. So again, just to summarize, we kind of want to see contracts that are very clear in who's taking what obligation, what is the standard expected of this person in respect of those obligations, how do they get remunerated for taking those obligations, and if things go wrong at the end of the day, what will happen and how will each party respond to things going wrong, and can lenders still be made whole at the end of the day from the contract. And Prima, if I might just add, structuring these contracts is again one of the more it's one of the bigger processes. You have the feasibility study that sort of helps governments think ahead in terms of these are the things that the market is likely to be asking us in respect of this project. So the feasibility study starts to tell you this project is viable if you do it this way and that way, and these are the potential risks. And then you start looking at transaction structuring, and transaction structuring helps you sort of refine these parameters a bit more. And what I would sort of encourage is there are, as Nathaniel has said, entities that are able to help governments on both sides of the table. So help governments with negotiating, with structuring, doing feasibility studies, structuring, and also offering contract negotiation assistance. I think it's very encouraging when you go into negotiations and you see that the government entity is sort of, again, as part of their commitment to negotiating good contracts, engaging with building internal capacity, but also engaging with institutions like ALSF or PIDGE who can offer support to ensure that the government position is reflected in their contracts. I think it's a good negotiation when all parties are present and in the room and are sort of, bringing their best foot forward to negotiate. So it sort of encourage the contracting authorities to take advantage of the funding and the financing that's available to support during the transaction structuring and the contract negotiation phase as well.
Thank you very much, Ivy. And like you said, a PPP is a very committed marriage with the possibility of ending. So we need to discuss who does what and how will they be remunerated? I'd like to hear from you, Nathaniel, very quickly in terms of practical things and practical contracts that have been structured in the 35 projects that you've done as South Africa, just for us to get a taste of what these obligations and remuneration for these obligations looks like, as pointed out by Ivy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll start with something that is in the process of getting to financial close. So we are supporting here the development of some embedded generation for 12 of our hospitals in the province. And the way we have structured it is in terms of the revenue mechanisms that we have actually ring-fenced the line on electricity usage for the Department of Health, which is essentially the revenue mechanism into the project. That's number one. Then secondly, obviously, this is going to be paid on the basis of availability. You must make sure that the private party must make sure that the energy is available. And we have structured in such a way that if there is any event whatsoever that might actually affect them so far as provision of that service is concerned beyond their capability, it's actually structured in such a way that government will assume that risk. But obviously, one has to also be creative in terms of allowing for the private party to also come in and provide some sorts of assurance to the fact that the power is going to be available, because these are hospitals that are critical. They are critical instruments in the hospital in terms of healthcare infrastructure. So we need to make sure that there is availability always. So that's how we've structured that. We've also made sure that in terms of events that might be beyond the capacity of the private party, say for instance, if there's a strike at the hospital, which could be either on the public side or private side, we give them some relief of some sort so that they are able to make sure that they are able to make sure that the system is functional within a short space of time, and make sure that there is backup for sustainability of those hospitals. So yes, we've reached financial close. The private sector is on board, and they've accepted the way we've allocated the risk from that perspective. And as we speak, construction should be starting sometime around September of this year. Thank you, Prima.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That's very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to see that the government of South Africa, for this particular project, which is a health sector project, and we know that health sometimes is it's difficult sometimes to be able to foresee those revenue streams that Ivy was talking about, but the government has then come in to assist and to mitigate some of these risks by ensuring an efficient flow of energy to the project, which is usually one of the key risks, and the government is willing to assume that risk and therefore probably manage the costs associated with the project. So speaking of creativity, I would like to come back to you, Ivy and Maud, to just tell us about some creative structures. I'd like to hear a bit more examples. So Nathaniel has told us about the hospital project that's coming up in South Africa. I'd like to hear, based off on your work in terms of the legal advice that you give Maud and the financial support that you give Ivy, what kind of creative structures have you seen on the continent? And I'll come to you, Dr. Gori, as well, simply because of your bird's eye view on these projects. Over to you, Maud.
Okay, thank you, Prima. One creative structure I would like to highlight comes from a wastewater treatment PPP project that the LSF is currently supporting in Africa. As you know, wastewater plants are not necessarily the easiest project to structure as PPPs. So the project involves the National Sanitation Utility and the Public Contracting Authority, and as well as a private partner that will be responsible for designing, building, financing, operating, and maintaining the infrastructure. The project is still at the bidding stage, so I will not talk about the exact country or the exact parties being part of this project. But the way that the government and its PPP unit have approached the financial structuring with the support of the legal counsel selected by the LSF shows some really thoughtful innovation that could lead to, hopefully, other successful bankable PPPs on the African continent. The idea is to break down the private partners' remuneration into 4 clear components: the investment recovery, operations and maintenance, renewal cost, and management fees. Each component is assigned a dedicated revenue stream, and it's a little bit what Evie talked about earlier. And the currency of payment for each of these revenue stream will be matched to the nature of the cost. So, for example, investment components will be paid in euros, while the operation and maintenance and management fees would be paid in local currency. This structure not only supports transparency, but also helps with risk allocation and improves financial predictability for both the government and the investors. Now, of course, a key concern for lenders is how this payment will actually be secured. The utility is supposed to handle payments, but its creditworthiness is limited. And at the same time, the government has indicated that it cannot offer a full sovereign guarantee. So here's where it gets interesting. One of the creative options on the table is a tripartite agreement between the government, the utility, and the private partner. Instead of offering a sovereign guarantee, the government would formally commit through this agreement to directly transfer funds, especially the investment and renewal payment, to the private partner on behalf of the utility in the event the utility would not meet its obligation. In addition, the total cost of the project will be included in the finance law, offering a level of predictability and commitment without creating contingent liabilities on the government's balance sheet. Another measure under discussion, which is quite standard, but I want to mention it because it shows how we can put together different options and solutions, is a payment guarantee from the utility itself in the form of an on-demand bank guarantee. This tool does not fully satisfy the lender yet, since it only covers some components, but it is a step toward addressing liquidity risk in the short term. And finally, a smart legal feature being proposed is that any failure by the government to meet its commitment under the tripartite agreement would be treated as a default by the utility under the PPP contract. This would help to bridge the accountability gap and give the private partner more comfort. So while none of these mechanisms have been finalized yet, what is encouraging is that the government is really willing to think creatively, using a combination of public budgeting commitments, targeted guarantees, and strong contract design to address payment risk, which is, as you know, very often the most sensitive issue regarding PPP bankability. So the proposed structure for this project lies on a nuanced understanding that bankability is not just about ticking a box, here the sovereign guarantee box. And in an era where many African countries cannot afford to provide sovereign guarantee, this approach demonstrates that this nation can tailor PPP structures to their specific and financial realities, while still making the project attractive to investors and lenders. Thank you.
Thank you, Maud. And I have had a transaction advisor describe, a legal transaction advisor describe himself as an engineer, because he says our role is to engineer ways in which we ensure that the IVs of this world are paid. And so you come up with all manner of structures. And what I'm hearing from this project is that you're looking at ways there's a currency risk that's addressed, there's liquidity risk, there's all manner of risks that are trying to be addressed the same way an engineer would say, let's mix this and mix this and mix this to sort of address all manner of risks. So Ivy, let's hear from you what creative things are being done. And I know that lenders are coming up with all manner of interesting products. So it would be good to hear how you support projects on the African continent.
Sure. I really like that sort of description about it's kind of thinking about sort of thinking of resolving the issues that come with projects. And I think there's been a lot of creative thinking about different kinds of products that can help bridge some of the gaps. As Maud has observed, it's very often the case now that getting sovereign guarantees might be difficult for governments. And so some of the structures that we're starting to see that have given more confidence include, I think a very good example, I think I can probably speak about this because it's public knowledge, is I think some of the very first projects, PPP projects to reach financial close in Kenya were under the Highway Annuity Program, which was underwritten by a public fund that was created to be funded through budgetary support to basically guarantee payments to private parties that won bids to develop a suite of roads in Kenya. I think the sort of, and we start to see a bit more thinking around these kinds of products, because if governments can see opportunity to consolidate funds that are available, particularly for social infrastructure, into funds that can then provide immediate recourse, or the fund acts as sort of a payment guarantee for the private party, it does give confidence to lenders that if you have a contracting authority that does not necessarily have great creditworthiness, this is an alternative that will be available to provide payments for the lifetime of the project. I think just taking that discussion further, we've seen this kind of thinking again around other kinds of social infrastructure, including street lighting. Again, these are all sort of the roads one has actually been done, but the rest are still in concept stage. But just to take it further, I think it's not, the commitment is not just in the creation of the fund, it's also in the funding of the fund. And so you kind of want to see a track record of the fund actually being funded and a track record of the fund actually making the payments that it's supposed to make. I think that does give you a bit more confidence as a financier, and speaks to the sort of creative thinking around not necessarily taking on or issuing payment guarantees. I think another way that we've seen some creative thinking around PPP projects is sometimes you just have to unbundle the PPP project. You kind of have to start thinking around what is the source of revenue and what is the connection to the source of revenue. In some cases, particularly in water infrastructure, I think we've had success with one bulk water PPP project where it was a combination of on the one hand, we had a very great revenue structure where we had a fixed capacity charge that was meant to cover the costs of senior and junior debt. We had fixed operating and maintenance charges. We sort of had that sort of three-layer, a layer of, in the tariff was created specifically with thinking about 4 key revenue streams that were needed for the project. So at the very basic level, the tariff would always take care of lenders' needs. I know that's not a very good thing to hear, but at the very basic level, the tariff would take care of lender needs, and then operation costs. And you kind of want to see the thinking around a cost-reflective tariff. If you're not seeing a cost-reflective tariff, we want to see, we sort of thinking about different ways to sort of support the tariff in order for capital needs to be met. And some of the interesting things we're seeing is sometimes you just come to the realization that we need to unbundle this project because the total capital costs of the project are too big for what we're trying to propose. And you sort of give the private party the bit that they're best able to do. So we've seen this in a water project where the capital costs for the construction of infrastructure were financed through a concessional loan to the government entity, and then operations and maintenance contracts were issued to private parties on a bidding basis, which again is sort of like accepting that there are certain capital costs that just are better suited to be taken and absorbed directly onto the or by the government through concessional funding where available. I think the other thing that has been really interesting for us, and also I'm going to take this opportunity, Prima, to sort of talk about what we do as Page is, I think that when it comes to project preparation and when it also comes to transaction structuring and also financing, I think that we increasingly are seeing requests for viability gap funding to reduce capital costs on projects. I think that sometimes is viewed as, you know, an end stage outcome, but I would sort of encourage contracting authorities and governments to think of that as they're doing the feasibility study. So sort of already recognize the weaknesses in the revenue profile for the project, and then start to recognize some of the challenges that you might have with the capital costs of the project, and start to think about what are interesting viability gap funders who have, you know, who can provide additional financing through viability gap funding to reduce the capital costs on the project. And sometimes this can be linked to sustainability objectives, can be linked to impact objectives. So we're seeing a bit more interest in that sphere. And I would sort of encourage the contracting authorities to sort of take advantage of that pot of funding that's available, because it's a great de-risking mechanism. It sort of particularly because we recognize that PPP projects do have, in many times, social objectives. It can really help reduce the pressure, reduce the financing pressure, and reduce the pressure on the contracting authority and the government in terms of what commitments they actually have to make. So you kind of see that as the viability gap funding or the concessional capital sort of coming in the stack of funding that's available to reduce those costs, and then that sort of bridges that gap between what we expect from revenues and what the costs are of the project. So I think we're seeing a bit more interest in that. So to recap, you know, creative structures around creating alternatives for sovereign guarantees through funds, national, subnational funds, great, are very, you know, very useful instruments, and sort of already, you know, fund the funds when you do set them up. Start to think about how you can onboard viability gap financing from the very beginning, and also start to think about how you can sort of unbundle PPP projects in order to achieve maximum efficiency, so the government actually takes risks that it can during the project life.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivy. And I think it's clear you've given us 3 clear action plans, and these can be contracted, they can be input, but how do we unbundle? And I think that's what we're hearing, because we're seeing that at the ALSF as well. Dr. Gori, coming to you, what have you seen creatively done to ensure that we are properly structuring the projects for which we have feasibility studies?
Yeah, such a lot has already been covered here in terms of examples, and a couple come to mind. There's a PIDA priority project in Southern Africa. It's a bilateral hydro electric power project that has been in development for the last 12 to 15 years. So I'm going to bring some examples from that. And there's a sustainable, sticking with our housing analogy, there's a sustainable housing project that we're supporting in West Africa that I'll speak to in a second. But before I do so, I want to go back to what really drives this sort of creativity in project structuring that we are seeing. It is this sense of the fact that PPP is a very long-term marriage, that it makes sense, right, for the parties to be committed to it being successful. And that requires, you know, flexibility, that requires clarity, and that requires a real focus of ensuring bankability. And, you know, again, this bankability word, I want to break it down to make sure that we're clear that it provides, you know, a certainty around revenues and paying back, you know, financiers. That's really what drives projects. So in this, I'm not at liberty to say the actual project, but I think people who are close enough to projects will probably know it. This is a project that has had to be unbundled. You know, Ivy was talking about the importance of unbundling large-scale projects. It's over $4 billion in terms of the capex alone. So it's gone through at least 2 failed transactions, right? And now we are at the stage with this project where we're taking a step back and trying to understand why is this very viable, economically and commercially viable project, why is it not succeeding? Well, it won't surprise you to hear that the big challenge is the idea of, the foreign exchange risks that really come from doing these kind of projects, where there's a mismatch between the currency, the funding currency, and currency that revenues are generated. This is a country that, this is a project that both countries that are part of this, they have significant fiscal challenges. So their ability to provide any sort of funding support or subsidy is, zero. And the recognition is now there based on the last transaction that, had to be pulled back. To compound on that, right? The idea of providing a sovereign guarantee is one that is not on the cards, but there's clarity in that. So what's being done now, because it's a power project, right? In a country where, in countries where there are current exchange restrictions, the governments have both committed to removing those currency exchange restrictions and providing that sort of assurance to make sure that a private sector funder coming in will be able to repatriate their funds. The need for the power to be wielded just for the public utilities in those countries who also have, because they stay back, who also have these sort of fiscal challenges, has been removed. And so it is now a case that the structure is now providing for back-to-back agreements between the project sponsor, the investor, commercial off-takers, and the South African power pool, which completely tackles the commercial risk and the demand risk of non-payment. But this is an arrangement that took years, right, for the government to be able to support. And having the African Development Bank, I've got to say, around the table, helping to make the case for this sort of innovative thinking around tackling the commercial risks associated to this project has been very, very important. And I make that point to say, beyond your transaction advisors, get your transaction advisors, commercial, financial, legal, but also make sure that you are working with regional DFIs who are really, really committed to helping with the structuring conversation. That's a key lesson here. We have Ivy from Pitch, and the second example comes from West Africa, where working with a pitch facility there, we were able to provide sustainable housing projects are very challenging because there is, as you say, a social bent to it. But the project still needs to wash its face in terms of its ability to pay the loans. And this was in a suburban. This was a sustainable housing project in a suburban area. And what that basically means is that the effort that needed to go into ensuring the credibility of the off-takers was very, very significant. The lenders, in terms of access to capital, the lenders required, and we got this from the market sounding and market testing, some sort of guarantee to reduce the cost of borrowing from double digits to single digits, right? And that pitch facility was critical in making that happen. Now, that's not the end of the story. I think as the project progressed, and again, don't forget this sort of marriage of partners that allows for flexibility and engaging as things begin to evolve, we began to realize that for that risk mitigation, partial risk guarantee to be effective, more work needed to be done to ensure the credibility of the off-takers. And this is this is a conversation that the parties, and this project is now in commercial close, and we're working through it, the financial close. The parties have had to sit down to actually think about how to make sure that the linkage road that was supposed to actually bring about the road infrastructure has a way of unlocking the commercial viability of housing infrastructure. The question now is, how is that funded? And then another conversation had to be had around ensuring that, because of the fiscal challenges of the contracting entity, that had to become a PPP. So again, unbundling that process to make sure that the PPP for the housing infrastructure was not held back because of the lack of the ability of government to deliver on its obligation. And so that led to another PPP, again, which was supported with a risk mitigation guarantee to ensure the viability of the substantive project, which is the housing, the sustainable housing project. But all of this within that sort of environment of the parties working together, not just together, but also with risk mitigation instruments and financiers to ensure that the underlying and the major goal was achieved, which is that project had all the infrastructure that was required to be able to fulfill the obligations to the private sector concessionaire for that, to be able to fulfill the conditions for the off-takers to sign up for the project. So these are the elements of the intertwining and the unbundling of projects to ensure that ultimately success is achieved.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gori. And I think what all the panelists are saying about creativity is just take the different parts, just take the whole apart and be able to consider the different parts so that you are able to identify how can we address all the different issues to make sure that the private party is paid. I am aware that we have 10 minutes and I have quite a number of interesting questions from the audience, but just before I run to those questions, and I'll probably ask you for just 5 more minutes so that we end at 35 past. Just before we run to those questions, I'd like to ask Nathaniel regarding the institutional framework of South Africa. I think there's a host of factors that has made South Africa successful, and one of it seems to be the effort that the government is putting within the institutional framework. And so you have a lot of institutions, both at national and at subnational level, that are addressing all the different infrastructure challenges and the PPP challenges. So maybe could we hear just a little bit about some of the institutions that have been put in place by the government, so that some of the governments on this webinar are able to pick and learn some lessons?
Thank you very much, Prima, for that question. I think for PPPs to be successful in any country, the government has to be strategic and intentional, which is what essentially the government of South Africa has done. So to start with, within the National Treasury, there is a PPP unit, which in a sense acts as the regulator and under assurer of the process so far as the development of PPPs is concerned. So they make sure that when you get your approvals and decision gates from feasibility, procurement to contracting, they give you the green light at each and every gate that you go through. Then beyond that, the government has also created a unit that is called Government Technical Advisory Component, GTEC, which essentially works with project developers, or call it users, who are initiators or project sponsors from inception of the project, developing feasibility studies, structuring and configuration of the procurement documentation, all the way until it gets to financial close. But beyond that, the GTEC unit also makes sure that they provide support and advisory in the monitoring and evaluation of the PPP. That is on the performance side of things. Then at a provincial level, government such as the Gauteng province has got an agency such as the GIFA, which essentially supports departments and municipalities in preparing and packaging of projects. But I think what I would want to highlight is that beyond just creating the unit or the agents, there is also support so far as financial support around preparing those projects. We all know that project preparation is not a cheap exercise. So there is support that comes from the budget. So far as supporting feasibility studies is concerned, hiring consultant to help you with preparing and packaging of contract documentation. Then more recently, what we have noticed is that, especially post-COVID, affordability is now becoming a key issue, not only for user pays PPP, but also for government pays PPPs. So the government is actually taking a strategic call it decision to create another entity at a national level called the Infrastructure South Africa, which essentially is going to provide or is providing support for preparation and packaging of projects so that we drive more and more projects towards the PPP route. Supporting that is also an entity called Infrastructure South Africa, which is actually mobilizing, attracting private investments from the private sector so that they can support government projects. Then just beyond just the entities or institutions, because of what I've mentioned earlier on around affordability constraints, the government has also put together a facility called Budget Facility for Infrastructure, which essentially is a viability gap instrument to support or enhance the viability and affordability of PPPs. So we're actually beginning to see a number of PPPs coming on stream, essentially based on the fact that there is institutional support, but there is also government commitment so far as making sure that all the projects are viable. So for the next 5 years, we should expect a big uptick so far as PPPs is concerned. Thank you, Prima.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. And I think what we're seeing from the government of South Africa is really a commitment from the government to make the projects work. And so it's both a combination of the fiscal environment, the institutional framework, ensuring there's capacity. And so I think there's a lot for governments to learn. I'll quickly run through. I've noticed some of the questions were already answered. Questions, for example, about the role of viability gap funding. I think Ivy went through that, and also how do we make project market ready, and I think that has also been extensively covered. But I'll ask either Dr. Gori or any of the speakers. There's a question that there's a view in Africa that privately initiated PPPs are mostly seen as opaque and as dens of corruption. Do any of the panelists have any experience working on a successful privately initiated PPP? And can you share any pointers on what governments, project financiers and project sponsors could do to avoid the view that PIPs don't really work? Maybe we'll take, I'll take one of the panelists who can take a stab at this. If you've been able to work on a PIP, you could just give us some of the lessons learned. Dr. Gori, your mic is open, so you have to have worked on one.
I probably should have muted my mic, Prima. I've worked on several, and when you say one that has worked,
yeah.
Let me rephrase my thoughts in a way that is appealing to our audience. I think that privately initiated projects can work. And I think that when we talk about PPPs working, it needs to be more than that they're implemented. We've advised on projects that have been implemented, but whether they work from the value for money and public benefit perspective is a completely different kettle of fish. Right. I think that for privately initiated projects, unsolicited proposals to work, they got to really complement an existing framework of government priorities with clear alignment to development objectives, clear demonstration of public benefit. I think the criticisms that unsolicited proposals have is the skewed nature of the benefits that accrue from these projects. And that is why they become synonymous to corruption. And that is not to say, that correlation is causation, but it's important that once there is an unsolicited proposal that is there, the same sort of critical checks to ensure alignment with existing government development objectives is ticked off. The same idea of some sort of value for money assessment to just make sure that that is indeed the right way and the right partner to proceed with on that project. And I'm a big fan of ensuring that whether a project is unsolicited or not, there should be some sort of competitive process that it is subjected to ensure that the options that the public sector has in terms of contracting are wider than the proponent. And I think these are the sort of guidelines to put in place, because any sort of public infrastructure, we have to always remember, right? No matter how it is procured, right? It will be funded either directly through government or through citizens. And because it continues to be a public infrastructure, and just making sure that it is contracted in such a way that the incentives don't skew too far to the public to the private sector, that there becomes a public disbenefit arising from that project. So I think private initiated projects can work, but they shouldn't be subjected to less rigorous evaluation than conventional PPPs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gori. Maud, I'll run to you too. We've had a lot of analogies today, and I think the audience caught on. And so one of the questions is, given the very liquid and mostly gaseous situations of most governments in Africa, what happens if a government changes PPP policies mid-project? How can contracts protect investors in this regard? Very quickly from you, Maud.
I'll try very quickly. This is a very good question. And actually, it's not only a change in PPP policy that can affect the contract. It can also be any law that are related, that have an effect on the contract. So any change could have a bad impact. So what is important to remember, that a PPP contract is all about the economic and financial equilibrium of the contract. So what does it mean? It means that the public party has different rights. And maybe I'm going to take my civilist hat here, a civil lawyer. In administrative civil law, as maybe some participants know well, the public partner will have different rights, like ensuring the continuity of the public service, ensuring non-discriminatory access to the service. They will also have the right to unilaterally terminate the contract for reason of public interest. And in return, the private partner will benefit from several protections, including the right to maintain the economic and financial equilibrium of the contract, especially in the event of foreseen circumstances. So I know that the easy response to the question could be to talk about stabilization clauses, termination clauses, or strong dispute resolution mechanism. But if we really want to save the project, to ensure that the project will continue, hopefully it's going to be the intention of the government, we need to maybe talk more about what we call hardship clauses, or ensure that the contract includes rendezvous clauses, or provide for dispute boards, which are all different possibilities to ensure that the project will survive this if of course both parties are willing to continue the marriage, to use another analogy of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maud. And I think that's very, very helpful. Within 20 or 30 years, of course, PPP policies are going to change. Of course, PPP laws are going to change. So you must have a contract that has foresight to allow for these changes. Second to last, I'd like to ask Nathaniel, one of the members of the audience has asked, how best should tariff adjustment mechanisms be structured to balance investor returns as well as public affordability? So how do you have mechanisms that allow for you to balance the two?
Thank you very much for that. I think, first of all, remember the private party is assuming risk, and they must be equally compensated for that risk or well remunerated for that risk. So there is a risk that in the course of time, they might actually lose value, maybe due to inflation, or most importantly, if the commercial economics of the project does not make sense anymore. Like for instance, if there is a drop in usage of a piece of infrastructure. So firstly, I think to address the first risk, we should make sure that there is a proper indexation of the user charge of the tariff to either inflation adjustment on an annual basis, so that there is no loss of value. Then on the other side, on the commercial side, I think I want to come back to the example of the how train. There should be some mechanism to ensure that the public or the contracting authority can then step in and support a loss in revenue due to maybe a lower level of utilization of the asset, where that's when the issue of the patronage guarantee would come in, so that at least you're able to cushion the private party from any potential losses that might occur as a result of a change in preference. Maybe your users want to use another mode of transport compared to what would have put as a piece of infrastructure. So I think it's a combination of, first of all, you need to make sure that you protect your private party from such losses, so that at least they're able to be well remunerated. So there is need for that balance. But the main objective is to make sure that the private party is well compensated and there is no loss in revenue or in value on their side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. And I think we're coming to the end. Would like to hear just one final word from all the panelists. And what's one piece of advice that you'd give an African government to improve PPP bankability within the next decade? I'll start with you, Ivy.
Thank you, Prima. I think just based off the discussions in the previous panel and the discussions on this panel, I think that we do need to, again, strengthen the way that we approach project selection, project feasibility studies, and eventually the decision making around projects that are taken to market as PPPs. I think you sort of start from the beginning of the conceptualization of the project and sort of already incorporate thinking with the end in mind. Sort of think not just to taking the project to market, commercial close, think about getting financing for the project, think about the operational phase for the project, all the way up to handover stage, and sort of utilize the available, to the extent that the capacity is available for PPP units and contracting authorities in-house to do this. That's amazing to hear some of the wins that we've had, for example, from Nathaniel in Gauteng, and also from the examples from Egypt that were given earlier today. But to the extent that additional support is needed for governments to do this, I think I would encourage governments and contracting authorities to take advantage of the products that are available to sort of strengthen the project preparation and transaction structuring phase through providers. I will, toot my own horn like Pidge. Because that is such a foundational element of making sure that we're taking a project to market that sort of ticks off some of the considerations that we've already talked about. I think also take advantage of to the extent that they continue to be available, some of the alternative funding sources. I think there was a question about what do we do with unproven technologies, to sort of take advantage of alternative funding solutions that can take on some of the risk that would otherwise not be taken by your traditional commercial financiers. So look at viability gap funding, look at concessional debt products, look at some of the risk mitigation tools that are offered. As Dr. Gori said, some of these guarantees can help offset some of the very common challenges we see, especially around revenue clarity. And then lastly, I think I will say, also consider unbundling projects. I think we have to take a very creative approach to the way that we present projects to the market. I think market studies and testing the market during the feasibility study stage, during the transaction structuring stage, and even before you go to market is so important, just to make sure that the project is reflective of market expectations, and what are the possible points that the project could be adjusted in order for it to attract financing and be a project that can actually go into operations and eventual actual productive use. Thank you so much, Prima, and thank you also to my fellow panelists and the audience. This was a great discussion.
Thank you, Ivy. Maud, I'll come to you. What's the one piece of advice you'd give governments?
I don't know if we have time, but I would say the piece of advice I would give them is to come to the LSF for support.
Very good advice.
Okay, I can stop here. I have other things I could share, but let's stop here on this one.
Thank you, Maud. Thank you, Maud. Yes, institutions like the ALSF that provide transaction advisory support. Dr. Gori?
Thank you, Prima. What's the one bit of advice that I'd give? I think that it's important to note that we can learn as much from failed projects as we can from successful projects. There are pockets of excellence emerging all across the continent, of successful projects that have reached not just implementation, but handback stage. And if I was to distill all of that into one statement, it would be the success of any PPP project really comes from the rigor in which project sponsors in particular analyze the interests and the requirements of all the various parties associated with making a project a success. And demonstrating the political will that is instrumental to the success of projects, demonstrating it by having the flexibility to pivot, to lean on support from organizations like the ALSF, from other DFIs, from blended finance providers, innovative financing structures, including the idea of public sector concessionary loans being placed into structures to reduce the cost of borrowing. Nothing should be off the table. Success should be the only focus and objective, and the ability to adapt and pivot at various stages just to make sure that the public benefit that must be a central part of all PPP projects is delivered.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gori. Over to you, Nathaniel. Piece of advice.
I think we must invest in learning from each other as much as possible. Yes, South Africa is ahead of the curve in terms of advancements, but there is a lot of information that is available on the continent. I think there was a time that we actually had to go and do some benchmarking in Egypt, where we had to sit down with Atta and his team to try and learn from their experience and how best we can improve on our frameworks, but also improve on the way we execute PPPs. So my advice is that information is available on the continent. Let's learn from each other. Let's create platforms or ecosystems where we're able to share information. We have some lessons learned. Let's create a repository of PPPs on the continent what has worked, what has not worked. And in terms of what has worked, what are the critical success factors? What has not worked? What made it to fail, and how can we learn from that? So we need to create that platform for engagement, but also create a repository from which those economies that are starting can also learn from those that are ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel, and a big thank you to all the panelists and the participants for joining us today. I think that ours was to create conversation. We do not have all the answers, but at least I think we have been able to trigger some thoughts. And some of the thoughts that I think that we are leaving are, what's the ecosystem that you have? Can you unbundle projects? How can you think more creatively? I see Maud also went ahead to tell us to focus equally on project preparation, institutional credibility, and contractual discipline. Johnson Kilangi also has talked about the need to build and support PPP champions in government contracting authorities, so that you're just not getting advice and sort of throwing it at the government and then leaving them a 20-year project to run that they do not know how to run. And I think Ivy reminded us of the favorite word, which is tariffs. Are you ensuring that lenders are being paid? So are lenders being paid? Are governments being protected? And like Dr. Gori has said, nothing is off the table. The ultimate goal is to have a successful project. So how do we think? How do we rethink? How do we learn? And how do we relearn? Thank you so much for joining us today. We will have 2 other conversations tomorrow starting at the same time. So 12 p.m. GMT +1 and 2 o'clock GMT +1. So see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Have a good one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.